So, on to the main event. William Dalrymple can include Barack Obama among his readers, and I believe he has over 1 million followers on Twitter. He is our foremost narrative historian. He is the recipient of numerous prestigious international literary awards, including the President's Medal of the British Academy. He has several honorary doctorates. He's a founder and co-director of the Jaipur Literary Festival, to name but a few. In his work, he has challenged some of our most dearly held views on the British Empire. In his book, Return of a King, about the 19th century British incursion into Afghanistan, he paints a chillingly prescient picture of what is happening in that country again today. And this afternoon, he's going to talk about his recent work, The Anarchy, the relentless rise of the East India Company. And in this book, he turns upside down our views on the benevolence of the British in India and on some of our great national heroes like Robert Clive. Throughout this book again, he draws some fascinating and timely parallels between 18th century colonialism and our world today. Like all of his books, The Anarchy is that rare thing, both scholarly and exciting. In the words of Max Hastings, he is a master storyteller. So again, please write any questions in the question and Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And William Dalrymple, welcome.
Thank you so much. Very nice to be back in Berwick, albeit virtually. I grew up in North Berwick, but Berwick upon Tweed was very much part of my childhood. I had lots of friends that lived all around. I went up and down that coastline. And Berwick Station was always a rather ominous place because it was from Berwick that I went down to school in Yorkshire. And I have many memories of sitting on that wet, windy platform and looking out over the remains of the castle and out onto the Tweed and the bridge, having dragged my old trunks over the railway bridge, ready for the train south. But happier memories too from that area. My 21st birthday party was a very, very cold March picnic in Lindisfarne. I know that road happily and well, and I had a lovely revisit this summer when I last saw Anna at Quare and when I was up for the festival. Anyway, to work. What I'm going to be talking about tonight, if we could have the first slide, is a quick overview of what's really been 20 years work. This thing has just been published. It's The Company Quartet, and it's my 4 books on the East India Company, out as a box set. You can buy it in all good bookshops, and would make, of course, a perfect Christmas present. And so here endeth the commercial break. Next slide, please. So I'm opening a long way from India and a long way from Berwick, actually, down on the Welsh borders rather than the Scots borders. And this is the impressive profile of Powys Castle. Elizabethan crenellation, lovely Tudor box hedges. It's all very English until you go inside the long gallery. Next slide. And there you find, surprisingly, room after room of Indian loot. There is elephant armor, shields, swords, Mughal outfits, and also some 1 or 2 rather major pieces of major historic items. Next slide, please. This is looking through the palanquin of the Mughal governor of Bengal, Siraj ud-Dowlah, that Robert Clive defeated, and Siraj ud-Dowlah left his palanquin on the battlefields of Plassey, whence it made its way to Powys Castle, because Powys Castle was the dowry of Clive's daughter Henrietta, who married into the Herbert family. And if you go through the arch on the left of this slide, you enter a room where Tipu Sultan's battle tent is displayed. Gorgeous late Mughal textiles. But what is all this stuff doing in the middle of the Yorkshire borders, a very long way from India? Well, the next slide will show you the reason. And this is hanging over the entrance to the long gallery. and tells the story of how all this Indian loot got to Powys. Loot is an advisedly used word because it is actually an Indian word. Lutna is Hindustani for plunder, to plunder. It's a verb. And it first enters the English language around this time to account for the large amounts of East India Company plunder that was beginning to make its way back to the British Isles, but particularly, I think, to northern England and to southern Scotland, which had a disproportionate number of East India Company servants working in these parts. And many of the great houses in the vicinity, I'm not sure whether Paxton is East India Company, but many others in the vicinity are. This picture shows the moment that it really all began, because what you've got here is a Mughal emperor, Shah Alam, handing to an East India Company governor, in this case, Robert Clive, wearing the red coat. And yes, now here is a direct Berwick connection. The guy to his left is Archibald Swinton of Kimmergham, which is what, another 20 miles inland from Berwick. So Kimmergham was bought and built with the loot that Archibald Swinton, the guy in the red coat, slightly smaller than Clive, to the left of him, brought back from this very encounter here. So there's a direct link to Berwickshire. I'd forgotten about him before making the slides. Archibald Swinton, of course, is the direct forebear of the actress Tilda Swinton, who grew up at Kimmergham and whose family collection of Hindi pictures, which were Indian pictures, which were actually captured on the battlefield of Buxar, of which more later, when Shah Alam, the guy in the centre's elephant, ran amok and ran into the East India Company ranks and was captured. So this is a direct example of where a big chunk of Berwickshire money came from. So what's happening in this picture? Shah Alam is giving a document to Robert Clive. The document is called the Diwani. And the Diwani is a strange document, but it is basically the title deed that began British rule in India. Having defeated Shah Alam in battle, the East India Company forced him to sign this treaty, which handed over the rights to run the economy, for which you can read milk and asset strip, the two richest provinces in Mughal India, which were Bihar, Bengal, and Orissa. And when the East India Company was founded, Britain's economy was producing about 4% of world GDP. And India, the Mughal Empire, was producing about 40% of the world's GDP. The reversal of those figures was what colonialism was all about. By the time 1947 that India won its independence, India had been reduced to single figures as a world economy, while Britain had grown to envelop just under half the world's trade. So that simple juxtaposition from 40% of the world's economy run by the Mughals to 40% run by the British is the direct result of what we're seeing in this picture. And bizarrely, this all happened, next slide, not out of Buckingham Palace, not out of Downing Street, not out of the Foreign Office, but out of this single five-window building in Leadenhall Street in London. This, at the time of the Battle of Plassey and Buxar, was the company's East India Company headquarters. And it's not even the two buildings on either side. You can see those two tall buildings rising one story higher than the company headquarters. That's not it. It's just the five windows in the middle. And in there were, at the time of Plassey, a little bit before Plassey, just 35 employees in the head office. But they're running a network of trade. They're borrowing from Indian bankers, and they're buying large numbers of Indian mercenaries, the sepoys, through which as little as 250 English civil servants sitting in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras run an army that becomes, by 1800, the largest army in Asia. And that's not working for the British government, that is working for a private corporation. So, Matt, you know how we worry about the power of Google and Facebook and ExxonMobil and all these massive giants today? This is the godfather of them all. This is the daddy of all multinational corporations. It is the East India Company. and it's run from this one tiny office. How did it begin? For that, we go to the next slide. This is the man who came up with the idea. His name is Sir Thomas Smythe. He was in charge of customs. He was called Customer Smythe as a result of the East India Company. He called a meeting, next slide, in September 1599, and here are the people that attended it. And he wanted to raise money to found a company of English merchants trading to the East. And here are the people that gave the money. And you can look at the names, and you can see at the top is the Mayor of London, who gives £200, and then somebody called George Boates, who gives 1,000. John Enworth, I think, who gives 200, and so on, right down the list. And while these sort of big merchants are giving 200, 150, 100, 400 in some cases, you then have at the end of the list, 20 pages later, ordinary Londoners who describe themselves as haberdashers and leather workers and vintners. And they're giving £5 and £10. But what's crucial about this is it is a new idea. The joint stock company is something that was invented very recently with the birth of the Muscovy Company in 1550. And this is probably the fourth or fifth joint stock company in world history. And where it differs from, say, a guild where, you know, all the leather workers or the wool workers get together and go and buy things together or work for their joint interests, where it's different in a joint stock company is that non-executive people, in other words, people who are just shareholders, who just give some money, who hand in a check at some point, they get a share of the profits. And this model whereby you can invest but not actually play a part in the company is the beginnings of sort of big capitalism. This is what creates the great companies and great multinationals and corporations that end in the great corporations of our day. This is the prototype. This is the embryo. This is what you're seeing on that page in front of you is the beginning of that process. And having got the money together, Smythe gets, next slide, a man called Sir James Lancaster to sail the first ship. They go off and buy it, and off they sail. After a few problems, they get becalmed off Dover, and everyone comes and laughs at them because they're not moving. But eventually they do set off, and they reach the Indies. And just as they're nearing Kerala, where they hope to buy some spices, they bump into a Portuguese carrack. And as most of the sailors were previously privateers, or in our modern word, pirates, they just attack the Portuguese ship and they load all the spices from its underbelly, so to speak, into their ship and sail it home, where they sell the spices for £1 million. And that is how it all begins. Next slide. With that money, they buy headquarters. This is the first of the many avatars of the East India Company headquarters in Leadenhall Street, where it remains for the rest of its career. They also buy a dockyard in Deptford, and they slowly grow their trade. But they're not actually that good at it. The Dutch are better. And the initial trade of spices from actually Indonesia rather than principally India gets turned around in the 1640s, and they hand over basically the spice trade to the Dutch, who've got better sailors, better bankers, bigger ships. And they instead opt for what looks like the second best option, which is the textile trade with India, and particularly with Bengal. And that turns out to be the key to their success, because while spices get cheaper and cheaper, till today you can buy, you know, a little jar of nutmeg for £5 in the Berwick Sainsbury's or Tesco's. The textile industry becomes hugely profitable. So the company grows, and it works very closely with Indian merchants who share in its profits, because the big Indian traders don't have the same international ships that can sail easily between major oceans. They've got mainly coastal vessels. And all is well until, next slide, the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. Here is the Deptford shipyard, which I meant to show you earlier. Here are all the East India Company ships being built. Next slide. All is well until the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, shown here in a wonderful miniature from the Johnson album in the Bodleian, decides to try and overstretch the Mughal Empire And as often happens in these occasions, on his death, the whole thing implodes. The Marathas, who are these sort of peasant cavalry soldiers, very tough, very flexible guerrilla fighters, start attacking the Mughal emperor. Within a few years, they've captured, twice sacked Surat, the big Mughal port, and the Mughal empire is sitting more and more vulnerably, terribly rich, but also with less and less security. Next slide. And this, it's still got this enormous capital in Delhi, the largest city in the world, 1 million people, very, very rich. But everything is imploding around it. There's the Marathas in the south, there's the Jats around Agra, the Punjabi Sikhs are rising up in the Punjab, and everyone's wondering who's going to get this sort of ripe mango sitting in the middle, waiting to be eaten. Next slide. As you see the gorgeous view down over Chandni Chowk, which is the sort of Oxford Street or Regent Street or Faubourg Saint-Honoré of Mughal Delhi. Next slide, and it's none of the expected contenders. Instead, it's this man, Nadir Shah. Nadir Shah is a Persian warlord. He rides in down the Khyber Path in 1739, and he defeats the Mughals at the battle just north of Delhi. Next slide, at Karnal. And he invites the Mughal emperor, Muhammad Shah Rangila, seen here sitting in white, to dinner, and then he just captures him. He come without a bodyguard, very trustingly, and Nadir Shah doesn't let him go back. He just keeps him. They ride into Delhi, and the division of the spoils begins. 6 weeks later, Nadir Shah rides out, this time holding 8,000 wagons of loot, including the Koh-i-Noor, the Peacock Throne, and the other great diamond, the Dar-e-Noor, that's still in Persia. And he just runs off with the entire treasury. He's captured Delhi, no one can stop him, and as there's no money to pay the civil servants and no money to pay the civil servants of the army, the empire explodes. It sort of fragments into 10,000 parts. It's like, imagine taking a big Baroque mirror and throwing it out of a two-story window. It would shatter and fragment on the ground. This is what happens to the Mughal Empire. All those little city-states like Jodhpur, Jaipur, all the rigged Rajasthani forts all become independent city-states. The Marathas have a huge empire in the middle of India, so does the Nizam of Hyderabad, so do various other little Rajas on the coast. Remaining Mughal holdings in Lucknow, Awadh, and Bengal, and Hyderabad. But the whole thing is declining, and the people who really make hay at this point are not any of the rival Indian forces, but instead the two rival East India companies, British and French. Next slide. Here's what the French sepoys look like, dressed up very gallically in high fashion outfits with little shorts. It looks a bit like a gay pride parade, but it's not. This is a very serious military force, because the French and the British have both imported into India these methods of fighting developed by Frederick the Great of Prussia that involves horse artillery, file firing of infantry, and it's enormously successful. And both the French and the British find that they could very easily defeat, with these new fighting methods, all Indian forces sent towards them. But the first man to really feel the heat, next slide, is this guy, Siraj Ud-Dowlah of Bengal. And Siraj Ud-Dowlah is seen here riding off very militarily to war. This is, in fact, from the Swinton collection from Kimmagem, just outside Dunse, not far from Berwick, although it's now just been left to the Royal Scottish Museum in Edinburgh, the Chambers Street National Museum of Scotland. Bought it in lieu of death duties of Sir John Swinton, who was the successor to Archibald Swinton as Laird of Kimmagem. And Siraj Ud-Dowlah attacks Calcutta, and it's very bad timing, because he does so just as a British fleet arrives in Madras, headed by, next slide, Robert Clive. And Robert Clive is there not to fight Siraj Ud-Dowlah. He's actually come out to fight the French, because the East India Company's got some faulty intelligence that the French have landed in in Bengal. They haven't. They've gone off, in fact, to Canada. The 7-Year War is about to break out. This is 1756. And all that Last of the Mohican stuff is taking place on Lake Huron and on the American-Canadian border. But Clive turns up, realizes there's no French there, but hears soon about Suraj Udaulah taking Calcutta, sails up there, retakes Calcutta, and at this point, something very crucial happens. A banker called the Jugget Seth, meaning the banker of the world, who's the principal Mughal moneylender, and very similar sort of figure to some of the more influential Rothschilds in history. Jugget Seth basically bribes him to go and take on Suraj Udaulah and says that, don't worry, I know your armies are not big enough to take him on in battle, but don't worry, because we have, next slide, Mir Jafar, next slide after that, actually, has also taken my money and will also be with you secretly. So if we go back one slide, we see the Battle of Plassey. Here is Clive charging forward. It all looks very heroic, but in actual fact, it's all a stitch-up. The Jugget Seths have bribed Suraj Udaulah's army not to fight, and Clive wins very easily. By the end of the day, he marches into the Murshidabad treasury and just fills his pockets with jewels. Afterwards, when he's asked in Parliament about this, he says simply, "My lords, I was astonished at my own moderation." And the entire treasury of Murshidabad is put into punts and floated down the Hooghly to Calcutta, where it becomes the basis of the East India Company's fortune. Next slide. 10 years later, at the next one after that, 10 years later, at the Battle of Buxar, there is another East India Company victory, again involving Archibald Swinton of Dunce. The Battle of Buxar, Shah Alam is defeated along with his Mughal generals from both Bengal and Uttar Pradesh. 3 Mughal armies are defeated by 1 small British army. And this is really the kind of final gasp of the Mughal Empire. After this, Shah Alam becomes protected, in inverted commas, by the British. In other words, he's a figurehead masking this corporate plunder of Eastern India and Northern India. And it is literally a plunder. Everyone has come out to make money, and they do very quickly. So much so that actually silver begins to run out in Northern India because so much of it is being sent back. Many East India Company men are sending home as much as £1 million at the end of their career. And that's where these big Georgian houses across southern Scotland come up. Houses like Newhales outside Edinburgh, Kimmerjam outside Duns, we've mentioned already. These are all built by money looted and asset stripped from India and sent to places like Berwickshire, East Lothian, Edinburgh, Perthshire, and Inverness in particular. These are the places that gain most at this time. And the East India Company spends the money on enlarging its army. Again, this is a corporation. This is not the British government. Next slide. They grow up to 70,000 troops by the 1770s. And amazingly, by 1799, next slide, the East India Company forces have grown to 200,000 sepoys, which is exactly double the size of the British Army the same year, just before it rearms to fight Napoleon. There are literally 200,000 Indian soldiers fighting as mercenaries in these different regiments for the British. And by now, the company is hugely powerful and successful. Next slide. James Todd, also from the borders, is a tax collector seen here riding around on an elephant gathering taxes from the newly conquered territories. The East India Company develops a very lucrative three-way trade. What they do is that they plunder Bengal. They then plant opium in the areas which have been cleared. They ship the opium to China, where they buy legally, where they buy tea. The East India Company becomes the largest narcotics dealer in history, and sells vast quantities of opium to the Chinese. It fights 2 opium wars to have the right to do that. They then buy tea, which they sell in India, in Europe, and in, next slide, America. And the Boston Tea Party, it's East India Company tea that's being poured into Boston Harbor. Next slide. The East India Company, by this stage, has its own flag, as if it's a nation state, and as you can see, it provides part of the model for what will become the flag of the United States. Next slide. With its enormous fortune, it's built a new corporate headquarters in Leadenhall Street, now looking rather like Buckingham Palace. This amazing Palladian building filling the streets of Leadenhall Street. The spider at the center of the web, next slide, is the director in his boardroom. From where all the operations of a company that now controls about a half British trade and imports, and I think 40% or 30% soon of world trade, is all directed from this room. The company, next slide, now has enormous harbors where it ships off or where it loads up its storehouses from all the things being brought back from its conquered territories. It also has an extraordinary port, next slide, Brunswick docks, where it builds all its East India Company tea clippers. These are all owned by the company, this enormous arsenal of armed ships sailing backwards and forwards between India, China, and London. And it just grows and grows. It becomes an increasingly powerful and increasingly invulnerable state. But finally, the one force that remains capable of taking it over and destroying it, next slide, is its own sepoys. And in 1857, they rise up against their officers. There's only a handful of white officers, and they are in a right pickle in 1857 when most of their troops in North India turn their guns against them. And this is the uprising, still known in Britain as the Indian Mutiny, but known in India as the First War of Independence. There's elements of truth in both those descriptions. And it is the largest anti-colonial revolt to take place in the 19th century. It very nearly succeeds. The East India Company is taken by surprise. It loses the whole control of North India for 2 years, effectively. But at the end of it, what you're seeing in front of you now is the retaking of Delhi, which is followed by a general massacre of the all-male population and the rape and enslavement of most of the women. It's a horrible, horrible moment. Hundreds of thousands of people are massacred across North India. There are terrible. The rumors go around that British women are raped, and this is not true. But in the fury that this builds up, the British soldiers commit unbelievable atrocities, shooting dead all males they come across, making some of the sepoys they think are responsible lick up the blood of murdered women, sewing them up in pigskins, blowing them from cannon, all manner of stuff. But also just in sheer numbers, perhaps 200,000 or 300,000 deaths of ordinary civilians in the course of this uprising. And this is such a mess, and so expensive and so embarrassing and such a horrific business that Parliament decides to end the charade and rolls up the company, in our words, would nationalize it as part of the British state in 1858. But already the company is a greatly changed beast from the early days. In the early days, it was libertarian, free market dream of a company that could do whatever it liked and had no government control. But as early as 1770, it goes bust for the first time because it has looted Bengal so badly that there is a famine in which 1 million people die. And despite that, the company increases its dividend from 12 to 12.5%. So that its shareholders stay faithful. And as India is dying of starvation, the shareholders are tightening their belts and getting ready for Christmas and a dividend and a bonus. And all this leads to the company going bankrupt the first time in 1772. It's too big to fail, though, unlike Lehman Brothers. And the government gets its first stake in the company in 1774 in the Regulation Act, when it buys basically half the shares. So at this point, already it's moved into being a sort of public-private partnership. And by 1858, when it's rolled up following the uprising, next slide, and the terrible atrocities which follow, including mass hangings all over northern India, by this stage, the company is already partly controlled by the government. And so it's not a huge step to nationalize it. Next slide. When the company is finally rolled up and nationalized, Punch publishes this cartoon, The Execution of John Company. And just as the company has been famously blowing sepoys from the mouths of cannon, and you can see the East India Company House, that large Palladian building above the barrel of the cannon, is being blown up. And as it explodes, you're seeing the banners: nepotism, blundering, avarice, misgovernment, and supineness are blown to bits. So that's what people think of the company. And it's only at that stage in 1858 that we get the birth of the Raj, and the British government for the first time takes a complete control of India as the leading colony, and as it will come to be known, the jewel in the crown. Next slide. The company, of course, remains famous for its corruption as well as its fortunes, and the man hauled before Parliament responsible is actually the wrong guy. He's Warren Hastings. But I'm just going to end up with what the Lord Chancellor says on the beginning of this trial. Corporations, he says, have neither bodies to be punished nor souls to be condemned. They therefore do as they like. Thank you very much. Over to you, Anna. Hi there.
I'm waiting.
I can hear you, Anna. I can't see you, though.
I know, the host has stopped my video. The host has stopped me. Okay.
There you are. Fantastic.
Okay. Right. Hello, everyone. And thank you, William, for, as ever, such an enlightening talk, full of interest, made even more dramatic by the prolific slides, bringing those events to life for all of us. And everyone, please continue. We have some questions in already. Please continue sending us your questions and I will put them to William. We could have a question to start with, that the British government appears to have a very hands-off approach to this. We called it the Indian Mutiny. The Indians called it the First War of Independence, but absent from the story to a great extent would appear to be the involvement of the British government. Did they just take a sort of hands-off approach and leave it to the corporation to make money? Did they turn a blind eye? Did they know what was going on? It's a very interesting corporation government relationship, which I think would be very interesting to hear a little more about from one of your questioners. Thank you.
Sure. So yes, you're right. I mean, the key point is that, we've all been brought up to think about the British conquering India. It's not actually the British at all. It's an English corporation based in London, and it builds its own army. So think, Microsoft with nuclear weapons, or ExxonMobil with fighter jets. It's a horrible possibility, which in a sense was never repeated because of the hideous power of this corporation. When you have a for-profit organization asset stripping, looting and plundering the richest country in the world entirely for the profit of its shareholders, it's a very, very sinister concept. I mean, think, all those movies like Avatar, in a sense, have taken this idea and run with it in a kind of science fiction form. Where you have a planet being plundered by a mining corporation, but it's not. It's the same idea as happened in reality with the company in India. And I've been very lucky in the sense that when I started work on this company quartet 20 years ago, which was not at all a fashionable subject, but both elements, in a sense, have come to the fore. On one hand, we have a huge amount of fear and interest in the whole business of corporations. And how big government work, how big corporations work, whether it's ExxonMobil or Google or any of these mega companies, Microsoft, which listen to our phones and spy on us and read our emails for data collecting and harvesting, but also the whole business of colonialism has come to the fore. And in a sense, the British, knew that we had this great empire, but in a sense, it was just sort of packed up and put in the office in the attic in 1947. Pictures were taken down from galleries. Famous images of imperial conquest got packed off to provincial regimental museums and so on. and metropolitan in Britain really rather forgot about its empire. It wasn't taught in the syllabus. People didn't know this stuff. And now, particularly as we have a generation of immigrants' children who are now growing up, Indians in this country, people like Satnam Sangera, who's just published a fantastic book called Empire Land, asking all these questions. I am here because you were there, is the kind of strapline. The whole notion of colonialism is coming under the scanner again, and particularly our very fairy tale vision of it. We've been brought up to think of the British in India as really like a rather gorgeous merchant ivory movie where all the women were beautiful and wore long flowing dresses and floated around the Bangalore club lawns, where the Indians were represented by Maharajas playing croquet for tea at Simla. And there's happy elephants swishing their tails in the background. And it's a gorgeous sort of rose-tinted vision that we all indulged in. Lots of handsome chaps, looking like Charles Dance, sitting, drinking gin fizzes on verandas of clubs and so on. And what we forget is that, any empire, whether it's the Roman Empire in the past or whether it's the French in Algeria, is never run for the benefit of the colonized. It's obviously run for the benefit of the colonizers. So this is particularly so if the colonizer is not a state, which has at least some notion of responsibility to the colonized, but instead by a for-profit organization, which is in its DNA, it exists only to make a profit for its shareholders. That's the point of a corporation. So you have this very, very stark picture of the East India Company. There are bits of our imperial legacy which are ambiguous. Later on the Victorian period, you can point at point at hospitals and schools and universities and all sorts of things that would make one believe that possibly there were benign sides to colonialism, that, we brought order from chaos, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is, at this stage, it's just a loot and a plunder. It's an asset stripping, and it's very openly so. Moreover, the British at the time knew this. And if you read the letters of Horace Walpole or any of these Whigs sitting in London, they're appalled by people like Clive coming home with, £1 million and able to buy up any house in London or large country estates.
Okay, that's very interesting, and it ties in very nicely with a whole slew of questions on reparation. Several people asking, are there any plans for reparation for what we took from India, the great houses and so on, the jewelry, and someone else also says, this is such an awful story. Are there any good guys in it? So, yeah.
Well, it's a complicated situation. So first of all, the legal situation is that the Geneva Conventions forbid the looting of countries in war, and anything looted has to be given back. But the Geneva Conventions are not retrospective. They're only signed in 1920. So legally, Britain or France or any other imperial power is not legally compelled to give things back. So, the Queen does not have to give the Kohinoor back to India. The British museums do not have to give their Indian statuary by law back to wherever they took it from. Ethically, it's much more complicated. On one hand, you can make the argument that this is what empires have always done. The South Indian Chola Empire looted Sri Lanka. We ourselves were looted by Romans. You're not far from Hadrian's Wall in Berwick. A clunking symbol of Rome milking Northumberland and Berwickshire. When you're very close to Melrose, where there's a major Roman cavalry camp under the Eildon Hills. Should we start, if the Indians can claim reparations from us, should we start trying to think about reparations from Italy for ancient Rome? So there are many ways of arguing this, but it seems to me that the first thing, and the thing that we can all agree on without any equivocation, is we've got to teach this stuff. At the moment, we have this very, very rose-tinted, completely unfeasibly pro-empire version of things in our history books, in our imaginations, in our Sunday night dramas. And we have to start getting real. Our empire, may not have been the worst of them, but an empire's an empire. An empire exists to exploit a colony. And so we have a lot of teaching to do. It needs to be in the curriculum. We need to read about this. We need to understand what we've done, and we need to apologize. I mean, the terrible thing happens whenever the Queen or the Duke of Edinburgh or the Prime Minister goes out to India. They always go to Amritsar and lay a wreath at Jallianwala Bagh, but they don't say sorry, because once they say sorry, I think that legal. Once you apologize, it's taking responsibility, and once you take responsibility, you're open to legal repercussions. So the only Brit who's ever formally apologized in a position of power for something as blatant as the Amritsar massacre and Jallianwala Bagh, when however many hundred of people were gunned down by General Dyer when they're having a picnic. It was the Archbishop of Canterbury last year who went down flat on his knees and begged forgiveness. I mean, that should be happening. And we should be aware of what's going on. We need to teach this. We need for people to have a sophisticated understanding of this. But early attempts, for example, by the National Trust to, when I went to Powys, for example, the plaques all said this loot was the gifts of the people of India, and that's just nonsense. It's not historically true. When last year the National Trust started to alter the labels, saying Lord Clive was regarded as a plunderer by many and a deeply corrupt man who committed suicide, rather than the hagiography that had been there before, there was a lot of huffing and puffing from the right, and there's now this whole culture war going on with our current culture minister regarding the giving of unvarnished truths about empire is now all under the heading woke, and anyone who tries to suggest that the Raj was about anything except gin fizz on club verandas and so on gets told that they are sort of pathetically woke, and the idea is that this is some sort of leftist plot. But the reality is that we just haven't even begun to understand the nature of what we did abroad. And wherever soldiers go and conquer people, people die, things are looted, women are raped, and we need to know all this. In due course, it may well be that our children and grandchildren may consider reparations, returning gorgeous Indian miniatures from the British Library, or giving back fantastic Hindu statuary now sitting in the V&A. But at the moment, it's not going to happen because so many people are not prepared, are not educated enough to realize, in a sense, the guilt.
Thank you. And so, this is not. We have actually someone asking that question, saying, I'm 64 years old, and when I went to school, none of these topics were covered in my history lessons.
But that's still not.
I learned
you could be 16 rather than 67.
Exactly. Absolutely. And that brings us on the way to a next sort of group of questions. Someone has written, you say that there were the two descriptions of the Indian Mutiny and the War of Independence both had some truth in them. How would you describe this? And also, very interesting, we go on to, are there any contemporary records written from Indian perspectives? And I was very interested when I was looking at this to see that there are actually two covers for your book, The Anarchy, that you could call them a Western one and an Eastern one. And that got me also to questioning how Indians see our legacy in India today. And as you live there, you are our expert on this.
What was the first Indian perspectives, two covers, and what was the first bit?
The description again of the way of describing the Indian Mutiny and the War of Independence.
Okay.
Two different ways of describing this incident.
So three questions. The first is the covers. Yes, there's actually three different covers. There's one in Britain, one in India, one in America. That's quite normal, but there's no question that the British one, the publishers chose a slightly more soft, peddly one. It's The Irresistible Rise of the East India Company, is the English or British subtitle, which gives an impression of something sort of strong and glorious. I mean, I hasten to add that the contents of the book is exactly the same in all three countries. There's no difference, but the covers are different and the subtitle is different. In India and in America, it's known as, I can't remember the subtitle, but it's something like It's a far more blatant recognition of colonial loot and plunder, corporate violence, and the rise of the East India Company, I think is what it's called in America and India. And yes, I think there is resistance in this country to the idea that no one wants their forebears to be. Everyone wants their forebears to be wonderful. They don't want to know their grandfathers and great-grandfathers were war criminals and rapists and looters anywhere in the world. And so there is naturally resistance to this idea, but the evidence is there and it needs to be presented. 1857. 1857 is a complicated uprising. It was a massive national struggle in some places, such as Lucknow. In other places, such as Delhi, the sepoys came in, and the people of Delhi kind of didn't really join in the uprising so much. It was incoming sepoys coming in from their army camps fighting the British there, and so it was primarily a mutiny in many places, where it was the mutiny of the East India Company sepoys. In other places, it was a full war of independence where the local population joined in. I use a neutral term that I think is acceptable everywhere, which is the uprising or the Great Uprising, and that you can't really argue with. Indian perceptions of the Raj, very interesting question, changing fast. When I first went there, there was an idea that that there was good and bad, that we had given them some things like railways and tea and cricket and whatever. Today, there's deep impatience with that idea. We are seen as looters and plunderers. And at the same time as our Conservative government rather dreams of India as a lucrative market for British goods and an old friend from long ago who will save us from the wicked Europeans we've rejected due to Brexit, the Indians are heading the opposite direction and seeing us as sort of rather as we look on the Nazis as the ultimate baddie, and the British are the baddies in Indian films. We do terrible things and commit atrocities and are racist and vile, and it's very good in a sense to go to India and realize this, because as Robbie Burns said, you've got to see ourselves as others see us, and they don't have a benign view of us at all, less and less each year. In fact, India, in a weird way, sort of thinks India, the Britain is far more screwed than we actually are. The common idea in India is that we've now kind of sunk from this great empire to a eighth-rate power, being almost bankrupt. In reality, of course, we are quite a big economic power still. We are whatever it is, the fifth economic power of the world, and we still have a massive economy. We're a lot richer than many other places, but Indians view us as this sort of has-been. On the scrap heap, and good riddance, really, I think is the general view. These books, I'm glad to say, have been big bestsellers in India, but what people have been surprised by have been different from the bits that surprised people in Britain. In Britain, I think, and judging by your questions too today, people have been surprised and horrified that we were as horrible and as venal and as corrupt and as violent as we were. In India, that's no surprise. People know that already, and so they didn't have to go to my book to find it. What surprised people in India was the degree of collaboration by Indians. The fact that the armies were 95% brown Indian sepoys, recruited locally, and the fact that the money to pay for them came from Indian bankers who supported the company over local rulers. Why? Because the bankers knew that the company, however wicked it was, would always repay its interest on time, promptly with interest, and repay its debts on time with interest. And to a large extent, the story of what happened with the East India Company is the story of two groups of capitalists. On one hand, the East India Company Trading Corporation, making common cause with Indian bankers and realizing that their interests were the same. And an important part of this story is the collaboration of so many Indians. The Indian right would argue that a lot of this was to do with the fact that the ruling empire was the Mughals, who originally came from Central Asia, who were not Indian themselves originally. They were Muslim, and they were, they looked Central Asian. They had more Eastern eyes, more prominent cheekbones. They were taller. They were Pashtuns from Afghanistan, and the Indian right would argue that the Mughals were in some senses originally as foreign as the British were, and that's an important perspective to throw in. And in some cases, certainly, that the many classes in Indian society did not weep to see the Mughal Empire end. So it's a complicated story, and this is a big fat book, The Anarchy. It's you'll find hopefully all the different nuances expressed there. If you want to know more about 1857, that is the final book of the quartet, which is called The Last Mughal, and the story of 1857 is told there. I should perhaps quickly say what the 4 books are. Anarchy is what I've basically been talking about today. The White Mughals is a social history of the British in India at that time, particularly the story of how many Brits intermarried with Indians and took on Indian culture, which is a bit of history which is often forgotten. The East India Company, although it was more corrupt than the Victorians, was also less racist and more open to Indian culture. And that the attitudes of Kipling and Curzon in the beginning of the 20th century were not the attitudes of 18th century people, many of whom fell in love with Mughal princesses and so on. And the central story of White Mughals is the story of this girl Karanisa, who's a princess originally from Persia, but brought up in Hyderabad, and James Achilles Kirkpatrick from the Borders, who fell in love, and he converted to Islam, became a double agent working against the East India Company, which is a fabulous story.
Could I just say I've had some interesting questions on that very point about Britons who were. We get an image from the Anarchy certainly of British who were not interested. Well, they despised the Indians. They were not interested in them. They were not interested in the great Mughal culture, in their religion, in their artifacts. They were not interested. But there was, as you've just said to us, and someone has asked this question, could you tell us a little more about this whole class of British people in India who intermarried, who loved the culture, who spoke the languages? And I always thought that it was annihilated by Victorian virtues and of morality. But then I read in your book that in fact it was also to do with the fact that brown soldiers were not to be encouraged, mixed marriage soldiers were not to be encouraged, because their loyalty was not to be taken for granted, that they could actually be dangerous. So this was another reason why intermarriage was not acceptable after the Brits established themselves. So
it's a complicated picture. You get in the early period, there's definitely much more corruption and much more obvious venality. The 18th century was a more corrupt and venal period than the 19th. Yet you get then much less awareness of racial boundaries. To the extent that I actually done some statistics on this, thanks to the East India Company wills, which are in the British Library. What happened was that because so many East India Company soldiers and civilians died in India, in fact, most did. Most people that went out to India didn't come back. 2/3 didn't come back. Because of this, there were always legal disputes. People were contacting the company in London saying, where's the fortune that we Jimmy has made in Calcutta? We want our share in it. And it became a law to cope with this sort of legal challenge that a will would be sent home by every company servant, and it would a copy of it would be in London. Now, those wills have survived intact, and we know from them in great detail about the marital habits of the company servants. So, a lot of company servants, might not admit to their parents that they had an Indian wife and 5 Indian children, but they would in their will. They would make provision for them. And so this is a far more effective tool for understanding what's actually going on in the bedrooms and living rooms of these guys than anything we have official. And the wills show very interesting. They show that in 1780 it reaches a peak. 1 in 3 Brits are married to an Indian at that point. It goes to 1 in 4 by about 1800, 1 in 5 by 1810, and by 1840 it's kind of over. There are virtually no openly admitted Indian wives in the wills. And what has happened is that 2 things happen. On one hand, there is an increasing sort of Victorian evangelical Christian thing going on, whereby the Indians have moved from being interesting repositories of ancient wisdom, a bit like the old Romans, with the Mahabharata as the Iliad, the Ramayana as the Odyssey, and the same interest that we saw in the 18th century in Roman gods is extended to Indian gods. And the 18th century is very philosophically intrigued by all this. But by the 19th century, these guys have just become poor benighted heathen ready for conversion. So the combination of evangelical plus utilitarian plus increasingly, a new Victorian morality which comes in to sweep away the corruption of the 18th century. And so in this new spirit, there is a separation of races. And while you get a lot of intermarriage, a lot of Anglo-Indians, my family, who were a big East India Company family, intermarried twice, once with a Mughal princess and once with a Hindu girl from Bengal. And I've got both sets of genes swirling in my veins. And that was very common, but it runs out by about 1840. So you move, it's very interesting, you move from something which is corrupt, yet racially liberal, to something which is uncorrupt in the Victorian period, but racially bigoted or just racist. And
of course, someone has just put in a corollary to that, that this was, of course, the height of the slave trade as well. Yeah. So I mean, it's further complicated, isn't it?
The big thing we've got to take in is that Britain was traditionally a marginal power on the edge of Europe. If you're talking about the time just before the Tudors, let's say during the Plantagenet period, France, Italy, Portugal, and Spain are infinitely richer than Britain is. Britain becomes rich through two plays. One play is India and the East India Company and the looting of Bengal and the textile trade, which we dominate internationally. And secondly, we'd get rich from the slave trade. And those two things then provide the seed finance for the Industrial Revolution, which further enriches us in the late 18th century up until the mid-19th, and where then everyone else begins to catch up and our share of world trade begins to diminish. But it is an unassailable fact that Britain became rich from initially India and the slave trade. And these are things that we have shoved under the carpet that we don't know, and we need to teach in schools.
Absolutely. Well, we could go on forever. The questions are still coming in, but thank you so much, William Dalrymple.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for everything.
And we're getting, so we've all got the Indian Quartet, an idea.
The company quartet.
The company quartet. I apologize. As to put on our Christmas present list. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
For people who've been asking, yes, the recording will be put up onto YouTube. And thank you everyone in the audience for attending. Thank you as ever to the technical support. Any mention of this event on social media is good publicity for the festival. And again, as it's a voluntary charity, any donations are greatly welcomed. I see the link for this is being put up on the chat at the bottom, and it's also on the festival website and Facebook page. And there are some more events this evening. And finally, dates for next year's festival, 13th to 16th of October. And most of all, thank you from India, William Dalrymple. It's been a pleasure. I'm
in London at the moment.
You're in London? I thought you were coming from Delhi.
No, this time next week I will be flying back home to Delhi, but I'm still in London.
It's been a hugely interesting talk. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.